Hey, it's Ben, and this is Drambo by BeepStreet. This video is going to be all about the oscillators, which in many cases is going to be our main sound source. So you've got two just basic oscillator modules that are really the same, it's just in a different format. You've got a cool supersaw oscillator, and then you've got the FM operator. But we'll consider that an oscillator too. So all of these are under you open the module selector, they're under the generator, they're under the oscillator section. So I'm going to go to this track first. I'm going to add a filter. So an oscillator, just real basics here, it's technically always running, and it's annoying when it's running. But an unfiltered oscillator is going to sound different depending on what wave shape it is. But they need something after them to stop them from just running constantly. So the first thing I'm going to do under processor, I have a VCA set up on all of these, and we can crank that back up now. So your two basic oscillators, you've got one with like semitones and up or down 7 semitones with also octave control. And then you have one with just like raw tuning control. The fully tunable oscillator has a sine wave, and I'm going to pull up my oscilloscope as well. And this will let us see what the wave actually looks like. So sine wave, sine 9, which just looks a little bit different. It's sort of like a little bit less rounded. There's a little bit more like high frequency harmonic content, not a lot. Saw wave, pulse wave, which has pulse width modulation. And that can be very fun. Turn this down a little bit more. And then your triangle wave. So those are your basic wave shapes. The oscillator, this is the semi oscillator that has octaves and a different tuning. Does not have the sine 9 wave shape, but it has all the other ones. So basic controls are you can change the wave shape. You can tune them, obviously. You have pulse width modulation. They usually need a pitch input, and by default, your oscillator is going to look for pitch input, probably from the MIDI to CV module or the rack, if you're using an instrument rack. And that allows you to change the note that you want to play, which you'll probably want to do. And, on this module, you'd have to really fine tune your pitch if you wanted to detune it in some way. But what you can always do, you can add under miscellaneous utility, you can give it its own pitch input. And just because I don't think I've mentioned it elsewhere, be aware there is also an overtone pitch control. So this one's really cool. I'm going to add another oscillator real quick, so we can hear both of these, and we're going to control one of them with the overtone. So we've got our pitch, octaves, semitones, but then you can also do, I have this get its own. You can tune it to harmonic overtones, perfect overtones of your bass pitch, which just lets you do different cool things. I don't know. I think it's a really cool addition to the app. Sort of like the sub-harmonicon, because you can also do sub-overtones, which just sound insane and really beefy. So you do have pitch control on this module, even though it's not as straightforward as this one with octaves and semitones. So what else can you do? and these basically function the exact same way. So I'm going to use this one now. You'll see it has oscillator sync. So that means, we'll look at our oscilloscope again. Sync is going to tell the oscillator to start from 0 when we tell it to do that. So, first we can play here. So right now it's just sort of like free running. And what I think is going to happen if I change it to sync from like just the trigger input from the keys, you can kind of hear like a little clicking. It's not that distinct. But what might be interesting, let's mix these together again. So what I would like to do, I'm just going to have it re-triggered by an LFO that's kind of like going kind of slow. So now it's kind of clicky, but you have the oscillators basically like sometimes they're in phase with each other and sometimes they're not in phase with each other because this one's being re-triggered. And it might sound cooler. Let's add a filter so we don't totally get buzzy. And you can see here, they're like out of sync with each other. So what you can also do is hard sync one oscillator to another. And I'll just turn this one down. So don't hear anything different right now. But if we turn up the tuning on this one, so this oscillator, which we're hearing, is synced to the other oscillator. It's re-triggering at the same frequency. So it's always in tune, even though we're changing the tuning. So that's the sound of it sort of syncing. And you can see basically like that little wave is coming in the oscilloscope. So it's just changing the timbre in a kind of a fun way. Let me add in this one because it'll probably just be easier. Let's hard sync it again. We'll listen to it. So let me remove this. What if I wanted to like do FM? So FM is frequency modulation. I can modulate the tuning with another oscillator. So if I do that, now you're going to hear it going out of tune. Not an expert at this, but basically my understanding of the reason it's going out of tune, I think it's a linear FM. And that means that the way this knob works, in terms of like how the CV is affecting the pitch or the knob position, the middle of the knob is 130 hertz. And then the minimum value is apparently 1.17 hertz. But then when you go to the right of middle, or clockwise, I guess, you go through all these other frequencies. So it's not a linear progression of the tuning. And maybe I have this backwards. Anyways, when you're pushing the oscillator up, it's going above the middle point, and it's going through all those upper frequencies. But then when it's below, when the oscillator is down here, it's only pushing it down like 100 hertz or something like that. So it's not like a balanced FM. However, if you wanted something sort of like balanced FM, staying in tune is what I mean by that. You can sync to another oscillator, so it's always going to be in tune now. And then it's sort of FMing this oscillator, but still hard synced to the tuning of this oscillator, the master oscillator. So it's a little bit more in tune than it normally would be. And you can play with the different wave shapes. And you can get some new timbres going there. Now I'm going to move ahead to Supersaw. Just real quick. This one's really, it just sounds good. The Supersaw oscillator on the generator, super saw. It's like, I think 7 saw waves, and you have a couple different controls. So width is going to be basically like the amount of detuning for those saw waves. Of course, you can tune and change the octave. Mix is going to be like how much of the other oscillators you hear, and then to make it really super, full stereo. So it's just this really wide sounding, I would call this fat. You know, it's going to sound really great with a filter, especially at lower notes. I just think it sounds like so full, so cool. But that's another like bass sound that you can start with. Now, if you wanted to, you can make your own like super whatever oscillator just by stacking them and messing around with the modulation a little bit. But that's a very cool sound. So the next sound that I wanted to look at, just making sure we're recording, is the FM operator. So it's an oscillator, but then it has some extra controls kind of built in. So down here it has kind of like a VCA. So you can set the decay, you can set the attack. You can tell it to have sustain if you want. And then there's no like tuning per se, but you can set the tuning per ratio of the bass pitch. So it has pitch input, has gate input, velocity input. And then you can even set the end level. Of the oscillator if you wanted to. So the other key thing here is that it is a frequency modulation operator. So it's almost set up like a DX7 kind of operator. And the last thing that I'll talk about right now is the FM amount. So you've got 2 kinds of frequency modulation. You have phase modulation and then actual frequency modulation. And they both sound good. They just have different characters and they're doing different things to the sound. And then, if you start messing with the ratios of either one, and it's getting its FM input from this operator right now. You'll just get different kind of timbres coming out of it. You can go up really high, all the way to 16. So this would be good for like bell kind of sounds, percussive or metallic, or anything that you can, cook up. And then if you have anything that's like not really perfect ratios, it's going to be a little bit more inharmonic, dissonant, that kind of thing. So you don't just have to use the FM operators to do FM. You could do, for instance, just like maybe a saw wave. And of course this will work in poly too. And that's just a little bit more like, it's different than your regular FM sounds or FM synthesis, because we're using different waveforms. Play around with that phase versus frequency, because there's a lot of cool stuff there. And then other thing, even when you're not using the FM, this feedback control, basically, if we look at our oscilloscope again, so all the way to the right, all the way clockwise, it's almost like a saw wave with feedback. And then, it doesn't look like a pulse wave, but it sort of sounds like a pulse wave or a square wave. And again, that's totally modulatable. So you could have like an LFO on that. And it's gonna You can see it wiggling around. Definitely sounds kind of cool. And then that'll play through in the frequency modulation too. So, this is a great place to start with for your FM synthesis. So, another thing, if you notice, you can turn the ratio down to 0. And at this point, it basically becomes a through 0 FM oscillator. You can go look up exactly what that means, but it lets you create all sorts of cool FM sounds. Basically just using the sound source that you're sending in. So when it's set to FM 0, there's no amount. You just sort of get this little click. And that doesn't matter whether feedback is in the middle or all the way left or right. But as you start to raise the FM amount, you will hear it, and then we can see what it's kind of doing. I think it's kind of like doing FM on itself. And phase and frequency are going to sound different. Not too different. But you can also use that feedback as almost like a wave shaper. Sounds really good on lower timbres. Or lower sounds. It sounds good no matter what. But sounds a little bit wonky. Anyways, and you can run like really anything into this. It doesn't have to just be like a regular like synthesizer voice. It can be drums, for instance. So it's almost like distortion at this point. I don't know. It's kind of cool. Definitely there's some stuff to play around with there. So it's both like an FM oscillator and then also sort of like a distortion or wave shaper. What else? So those are, that's like the three or four basic oscillator types that you get. And you could stack up a bunch of FM operators together and kind of like recreate some of the classic FM algorithms if you wanted to. But, these are sound sources, but then they're also, this is a modular setup, so you can use them for lots of different things. I'm going to go back to, I'll start afresh with just like a oscillator and a VCA. And we can make it poly. So, one of the very basic things I could do would be to do frequency, like audio rate modulation on the oscillator. Not every synthesizer can do that. So, if you just want to experiment with this, I would audio rate modulate anything with the oscillator you're using for a sound source, or even like if you're not using the oscillator as a sound source. So, like the shaper. It's just like a distortion, whatever. Let's just disconnect it from any input. So now, there's no sound coming into the shaper, so it's not making any noise. But we can start playing around with both the amount. I can't remember which one. Nothing there. Maybe it's the bias. Yeah. So I think this only works on one voice for some reason. But I'm just oscillating the bias right now. And I can then oscillate the amount also. And it's sort of going to change its tone. And then we can try like different distortion algorithms or saturation algorithms. try different wave shapes. 3 might sound kind of wild. Ooh, I like that a lot. And then even like some of the wave folding might sound cool. So, you know, you could probably get those sounds just sending an oscillator through the shaper, maybe, but there's no sound source. We're just modulating at audio rate the bias, and for some reason that makes a sound. I don't know why. I'm sure some of you can figure out why it makes a sound, but I can't. What else could we do? So, of course, you can do like audio rate modulation. You know, maybe I'm just going to go all over the place. Just a couple of different things I played around with. So if we open up, like we're going to do a couple stacked sounds. And I'll just do one VCA after these. We can go back to poly. So I'm going to have just like a sine wave on one, and then I'm going to put another sine wave up here. Just going back to like using it as a sound source. So maybe I want like one of these to not track perfectly to pitch. So I'm going to add a modulator. I'm going to do a pitch modulator, and then, you know, it's already, the oscillator is tracking to pitch perfectly because it's just looking for pitch input. But I could then also have it like on top of the regular pitch tracking, key track just a little bit like sharp. So higher up in the keyboard or higher up in the key range, it's going to be a little bit out of tune. And then I could even add maybe like another one. And maybe we want to like tone these down just a little bit so they're not quite as loud. Make them a little bit higher. Their pitch. And then this one can be like a little bit flat. I don't know if it's flat or sharp, but just sounds a little bit more like natural. So you can add like some weird key tracking that isn't perfectly in tune. What else could we do? So you can also like trigger other things with an oscillator. What would that sound like? Let's do an impulse. No, it's just this little like clicky thing. And a VCA after it right now won't change anything. And there's a couple different impulses. And these are good for like using with the modal resonator to have like a something to like trigger a reverberating sound. But you can also sync these up to an oscillator. So we'll just do it with like a pulse wave. And right now it's just like the track trigger is the trigger or gate source for impulse. But we're going to gate it to the oscillator. So now what we're going to hear, we've kind of created like our own oscillator from the impulse. So we can change the tone, we can add noise to it, change the length of these different types of impulses. So there's sort of like some cool sound shaping you can do there. And now these can be modulated, but you could still mess with them and do all sorts of different cool things. So, you know, we could do, let's add like a sound source to a sampler. Okay, so I'm going to just throw in a flexi sampler, and I have a couple, I think these are the Adventure Kid waveforms, and one of them's just like a sine wave. Okay, so it's just a single cycle, it doesn't sound like anything crazy, but if I gate that to the oscillator, it's not going to be perfect, and you can mess around with this, but you know, it's almost a sine wave. So now it's being gated to this oscillator, and I could maybe mess with like the speed of it with another one. And then you can play with like the pitch. So it's almost like, it's not a wavetable, I mean, it kind of is. There's just one wave, and there's no table of them. But it's always going to be in sync with this oscillator, like being played to pitch. But then you can mess with all these other things, so like offset, and you can modulate these. So it sounds sort of similar to a wavetable. It's almost like a CZ phase distortion synth, I guess, because it's like a waveform lookup table, and then you're changing the speed at which it goes through. So all that is just to show you that there's a lot of ways that you can use the oscillators, or any of these, these tools in different ways. It's not just a sound source. It's not just like an oscillator for a subtractive synth. It's a part of this bigger modular setup. Sorry, I just keep clicking around. Anyways, so those are the oscillators. You can do a lot of cool things with them.